Welcome back to another episode of Extra Literary Affairs. This is episode 3 of our Stream of Consciousness September series. Joey is off on another literary adventure today, so we invited one of my favorite Irishmen, Ian, to join me as we spend some quality time with the ever enigmatic James Joyce. In this episode, Ian and I will be exploring Chapter 4 of Ulysses, which is entitled Calypso. Hello, Ian. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Jennifer. Thank you for having me.
We're really excited to hear your thoughts on this very important piece of work. But before we dive into that discussion, I'd like to share with our listeners how you and I arrived at this very unlikely moment, which is only slightly less meandering than the story presented in Ulysses. As you'll recall, about 2 decades ago, we met with your wife at the Great Books Weekend in the Pocono Mountains. And my friends jokingly call it my travel book club because we seem to meet in all of these interesting locations. Basically, it's a group of readers who come together every fall to discuss 3 or more works of literature linked by a particular theme. And why I bring that up is that as I met Joey in a book club, I also could say that I met you and Karen in a book club. I think there's something uniquely satisfying about meeting people in this way, which is very different than meeting them at work or in another different social setting, because you automatically know that the person that you're meeting has an interest in reading things outside the mainstream. You're probably not going to run out of things to talk about. So let's fast forward to the present. For those of you who have listened to our podcast before, Joey and I have a very keen interest in exploring literature outside of our cultural context. We're always stretching the boundaries of the types of things that we are willing to read. We read literature from writers across the spectrum of time, different nationalities, different writing styles, genders, genres, you name it, we'll read it. We recently explored quite a few stories that were translations from their native language into English. We obviously don't have that with James Joyce, but his literary style and his word choice did create some problems for me, which, Ian, I'm hoping you can help me translate some of these situations. The only common denominator in the things that we're reading is that they're quality writing. As Joey and I were preparing to read Ulysses, Joey mentioned it would be really interesting to get an Irish person's perspective on James Joyce and Ulysses in particular, because so much of the story is rooted in Dublin and in Irish culture. And of course, I immediately offered to invite Ian. So thank you, Ian, for accepting that invitation. How are you feeling about that process?
I'm looking forward to this discussion. I really enjoyed digging into this little bit of Joyce and, trying to wrap my head around it. I cannot guarantee that I've succeeded, but it's been fun trying, should we put it that way.
I think trying is a great word to use when thinking about James Joyce and Ulysses. Joey and I have mentioned on this podcast before that we had explored the entirety of the novel with another group of people over a long course of time, and there were so many different ways of approaching it. I, of course, listened to a audio version. I thought it would be very interesting to hear the different characters' voices come out as opposed to just reading it. On this trip through chapter 4, I did listen to it, but I also read it with my eyes. And I can tell you it was very challenging to separate those two experiences. I think I had much better luck hearing it aloud than I did processing it with my brain. For those of you who may not be familiar with James Joyce and his work, I wanted to share a little bit of his bio to ground us all in the same place for this discussion. James Joyce is considered one of literature's boldest visionaries. He was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1882. So he is not a recent writer. He died in 1941. We are looking at this a century after he published this work. So keeping in mind that we're going to have some dated timestamps in this particular work. He lived through a time of immense cultural and political change. He channeled that turbulence into some of the most groundbreaking works of the 20th century. He wasn't just a writer, he was a literary disruptor. When you take a look at the way in which he constructed this novel, you're like, this does not look like anything else I have seen before he arrived on the scene. Obviously, we have plenty of people who have channeled his inspiration, and we see a lot more variation in modern times, but at the time it was clearly something unique. His early works, like The Dubliners and A Portrait of an Artist as the Young Man, offers an intimate, often unflinching portrait of Irish life. That's where you come in, Ian. I'm like, does that ring true to you? We'll see. But it was Ulysses, which was first published in full in 1922, that truly shattered all the conventions that were previously in place. As we said in the opening, this is Stream of Consciousness September. This story very much fits into the flow of things. We have read 2 stories so far, and we were hoping to build on degrees of difficulty. I am definitely going to say this is a very difficult story. The story for next week is, I'm surprised that I'm even going to say this, is a little bit more incomprehensible than this story, so that will be something to look forward to. Ulysses was hailed by some as genius and condemned by others as completely incomprehensible. It was banned in several countries over the years, yet it became a cornerstone of modernist literature. The critics were divided. Admirers like Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot championed his radical style. They loved it. Joyce was their boy. They were very excited about it, while others dismissed it as unreadable. Joyce pushed the boundaries even further with Finnegan's Wake, a linguistic labyrinth that still baffles and fascinates readers today. We will not be tackling that. So, Ian, sorry, I think the invitation to that conversation just got lost in the mail. Don't know what to say. Whether you find his work exhilarating or exhausting, there's no denying Joyce's impact. He redefined what literature could be, turning the inner workings of the mind into art and everyday life into an epic narrative. So, Ian, where do you land on the exhilarating to exhausting spectrum?
I think I probably landed on almost all of the spectrum at different times during my attempts at reading this chapter. I first read through it quickly and felt like, at a high level, you can just scan it and get the gist of the story. There's a plot and a few things happen and he has some thoughts. But then you read it again and it gets a little denser. And the more you try, the further along that spectrum you go into I have no idea what some of this is meant to be about. Then I probably tackled it in a third way, which was look up a few of these things. I'm going to try to do a little bit of education to help me understand what's going on here. So then I sort of moved back towards the middle a little bit. I have to say, if I'm allowed to just give a little bit of background to how I maybe was being prepared for this moment all of my life. This is sort of anecdotal. When I was 10 years old, one of my favorite books to read was called The Guinness Book of Records, and it's still around. In those days, I read it cover to cover, read every year they brought out a new edition. There was always a literary section, and there was always a record of the world's longest sentence. And it was always James Joyce holds the record for the world's longest sentence, and it was a sentence in this book, Ulysses. And they used the term Joyce eschews punctuation. I always thought that was fascinating because I had no idea who this person was when I was 10, but I loved that word eschew, E-S-C-H-E-W. I thought it must mean that you just don't use punctuation so your sentences just go on forever. So I guess that partly gave me a little bit of intro into Joyce. And then 5 years later, Van Morrison, who's an Irish artist, came out with a song called Summertime in England, which if you read the lyrics has a reference to lots of British Isles artists and writers, and T.S. Eliot is one of them. But one of the sentences in that song is James Joyce wrote Streams of Consciousness books. And I remember hearing that and thinking, oh, this is that guy again, and this is something more about him. So I was about 15 probably when I first, heard that line. So all of those things just preparing me for the stage.
And as always, that is not what I expected you to say. I love that story. And for an American audience, the Guinness World Book of Records, it's the thing as kids we would read. It's like, what's the world record for how many ping pong balls a person can juggle while standing on a beach ball, right? It's like all these very wacky, very specific things. And so that originated in the UK, in Ireland, possibly by the Guinness Company. This is something that I learned, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm often taking some liberties with the facts when it comes to some of this. I believe this is the Guinness Company that produces that beautiful beverage that is the national beverage of Ireland, at least from my telling. So I thought that was also very interesting. What I thought you would say is that being a person who was born and spent a good portion of their early adult life from childhood up until becoming a young adult, I thought being Irish was the qualification that would cement you right into this story. I originally had proposed this to you and I said, hey, we need your accent. Can you bring your accent to the podcast? And you're like, I'd love to bring my accent to the podcast, but can I also bring some insight? Yes, we also want that. But primarily, I was curious, and so was Joey. I'm so sorry that he couldn't be with us here today. He's really bummed out about that. We wanted to know if some of these cultural references or the way in which the city was described, did that resound with you in a way that perhaps was different than either he or I would respond to this material, because neither one of us has had the opportunity to be in Ireland. I am a contemporary of yours. Joey is one generation removed from us, younger. And so I was just very curious about how those depictions of Irish life, with the caveat, a big asterisk right here, this was published in 1922. So we're 100 years into the future from when this was written. And does that have any impact?
So there are echoes of things that I remember growing up that I see in this chapter. A couple of examples would be, and I think probably my favorite scene in the chapter is at the butcher's, because I do remember going with my mother to butcher shops where you bought your meat. There was no supermarkets that sold meat, so everything was fresh in the butcher, and the butcher had every cut of meat, including all of the offal. We had liver, we had kidney on our menu all the time, so that resonates as his favorite type of food is the offal. He's eating kidney in the chapter. We would have had it as steak and kidney pie that my mother made. That was how we always had kidneys, and liver would have just been fried, sliced liver with onions and potatoes. So that definitely resonated. I can remember being in butcher shops and seeing how a real butcher operated, probably hacksawing his way through joints of meat in the background. Making the tea was another one that I enjoyed reading about, because of course everyone makes tea. It's not just in Ireland, but every family has their way of doing it. And in our family, I recall we always had tea leaves, not tea bags, at least when I remember growing up. In the chapter, there's a line where Molly shouts down, "Scald the pot," which is put boiling water in it before. So this is always a bone of contention in our family. We didn't only scald the pot, but my mother would then boil the teapot on the stove so that it boiled. And I was always, you don't need to boil it. It's hot enough. It was always a big fight. So I laughed, when I read that, scald the pot. So those are just a couple of things that made me feel like I remember this from my own childhood. This sounds like things that I remember. We had an outside toilet in our house when I was growing up, which is another thing that sort of sounded familiar. We tried not to use it. We also had one upstairs in the landing, same as him in the chapter.
And that to me is quite remarkable, given the time frame that was still in common use in Ireland when you were growing up. I think that is very interesting. And also for me, I did not grow up in a household that had a tea ceremony or did anything in particular. So when they said scald the pot, I'm like, what are they doing? And then I was like, oh, right. That's when you get it really, really extra hot. And I appreciate that you said you've already scalded it. The steam has come out. It's boiling hot. Like, it is so hot. Well, let's just boil it again just to make sure it's hot enough. And I was like, no, I think we've covered that base, Mom. Thanks. I wanted to just do a really quick recap of one interpretation of this particular chapter. So what is this chapter about? Chapter 4 of Ulysses is also called Calypso, which we'll get back to that title and why that may have some significance to the way in which we interpreted the things that were happening. It's the first appearance of Leopold Bloom in this novel, Ulysses, and he is this novel's central character. It's a quiet domestic start to his day in Dublin. It starts on June 16th, 1904. People around the world celebrate Bloom's Day. They are very much tied to June 16th. It is a worldwide phenomenon, happens every year and has for a very long time. So Bloom is preparing breakfast, tea and buttered bread for his wife, Molly, and a pork kidney for himself. He feeds the cat, muses about her mysterious feline mind, and then he heads out to the butcher. When he's home, he collects the mail, including a letter for Molly from Blazes Boylan, her lover. Kind of an uncomfortable scene when you are bringing your wife breakfast in bed and you have to also bring her mail, which is a note from her lover. A little awkward. She does some kind of shady things in this particular portion of the story. That tension is definitely under the surface. You can see that this is not a completely happy union. He walks through the city. His ideas thought from exotic places to reincarnation, from real estate to religion. He is all over the place. What could you possibly be talking about? In true stream of consciousness style, I'm going to end it here. This chapter, according to the experts, we are not the experts, but the experts say the chapter loosely parallels the Odyssey's Calypso episode, where Odysseus is held captive by a goddess or a nymph called Calypso. Here, Bloom is metaphorically held, enthralled, trapped on an island called Ireland by Molly, and their domestic sphere is really starting to unravel. This sets the stage for his own modern Odyssey, right? He is going to go out into the world and find his way home. I just wanted to mention that because Joey and I often say, what happened in this story? What was the point of any of this? On the surface, yes, as you said, he wakes up, he does breakfast, he goes to the butcher's, he walks around, he comes home. That seems pretty straightforward. But there's so many other layers of meaning, starting with Calypso. So, Ian, you mentioned that happened to be one of the references that you looked up. Would you like to talk a little bit about what that was like for you or what that means from your viewpoint?
Absolutely. So I confess I have not read Homer, and I need to do that at some point. I did try to read Ulysses, the Joyce version, at one time in my life, and I gave up. So I have not read the story in either form. But I did check out who this Calypso person was, and then realized, this is the nymph that held him captive. So that then made sense about what this chapter is meant to be about. There was the little reference to the painting above the bed of the nymph that ties it all together, I suppose, later in the chapter.
And I appreciate that you said that because that brings to mind all of these little gems. One way to experience the story, which is the way that I experienced it by listening to it. There's another way of reading it. There's a third way. I have friends who have done this where they have an annotated book and they have a research book next to it. And these 5 lines reference 6 paragraphs worth of material. I'm not interested personally in diving that deeply because it robbed for me in that reading the joy of just experiencing the beautiful language that he has. It's the language, it's the jumping from idea to see if you can follow him. It's like, a butterfly. Can you see where he's landing on all of these different flowers and how they're all connected? I will give you one tiny little plug. Hopefully in our reading life together, I know we often rope each other into reading various things that we wouldn't on our own. Emily Wilson did a beautiful translation of the Odyssey, and it's a 5-star read. It is the best way, in my mind, to experience the Odyssey. So when you are ready to take that leap, that is the version I would definitely have you jump into. Her language is just really very poetic as opposed to the standard text, which is by this guy called Fagles, which is great, but he's no Emily Wilson. I'll just leave it at that. You referenced that at one point in your life, you did attempt to read Ulysses. I just asked you to read chapter 4. Nothing before, nothing after, just that moment in time. Did that story hold together for you? Was that enough to keep your attention? And does it make you want to read more? Or are you like, I kind of get the point, I'm done?
No, I think it makes me want to read more. Like I said, reading the same chapter several times and in several different ways probably makes me feel a little bit more confident that I could tackle Joyce and get through it. And what I mean by that is, for example, in some of the stream of consciousness sections of this chapter, for example, when he's thinking about a foreign country, somewhere in the Middle East, it sounds like, we don't know exactly where. I found that reading it quickly and just letting it flow over me gave me a better impression of what he was thinking, probably in that moment, than trying to dissect every word and really figure out exactly what he was trying to mean word by word. That doesn't work. And I think that probably is relevant for the whole book. It probably wouldn't work to try and read this whole book painstakingly trying to understand every word. It probably will be better if I do come back to it to try to just let it flow and read it once and keep going. And I will have gotten the gist of his thought process, stream of consciousness. I don't need to be able to figure out every single reference or every single meaning, and still enjoy the book, I hope, when we get there.
I really appreciate that, Ian, because one of the things that Joy and I often talk about is there a quote unquote right way to read a book. We are not the reading police. If you read the book, and enjoyed it, had a reaction, read the book and hated it. If you felt something, in our mind, you did reading correct. If you had any sort of emotion, that sounds correct to me. I was recently on a call with another group of people, and somebody gave me this beautiful image of instead of trying to dive in and get really deep, just float on top of the narrative. Just let yourself go wherever it takes you and enjoy that encapsulation, enjoy that feeling. I think that's exactly what you said you did. Yes, I could stop every sentence and look up all of these references, but that breaks the flow. My unique perspective when I was listening to it, it's a compelling story. I was like, and then what happens? And then what happens? Kind of nothing happens, but a lot happens. As a stream of consciousness narrative, this is my wheelhouse. I love flitting from idea to idea. And it's like the thing I said 5 minutes ago is now going to come back up in a different version. I just really appreciated that layering. But I can also imagine my father used to say often to me, don't overthink it, right? Just take it for what it is and don't try to go so deeply because that may not be as enjoyable. I have another group of people that love eking out these little tiny references that they're like, five scholars agree that he was talking about this when he mentioned that. So happy for you. I am so happy for you. But for a typical average reader, the playfulness, the beauty, the vividness in which he describes things that are things that you and I would not in a social conversation talk about. His trip to the bathroom, his checking out the lady in line at the butcher shop saying, like, oh, I need to hurry because I want to like walk down the street behind her and observe her, and then getting a little annoyed that it took too long and he didn't. He's like, oh, it doesn't matter. There's going to be another woman walking by that I can look at anytime. There were just a lot of interesting things. The way in which Joyce was unflinching about saying anything that he was feeling. There's a lot going on in there that I think in a typical daily interaction with another person, you would have no idea all of that was going on in the background because it's not polite to say, but he would just write it without hesitation.
Yeah, that was really the eye opener for me because again, I don't really even remember what I took the first time I tried to read it, but really understanding that this is stream of consciousness. He may be standing in that butcher shop and it took him 2 seconds to have all of those thoughts, but it took a whole page to write them down because he really wrote everything that he was thinking as it jumped from one thing to another. Well, that's sort of quite a different way of writing and certainly a different way of reading what someone's trying to say rather than them just telling what they did. So I really enjoyed that kind of revelation to me. I suppose that's one way to put it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And one of the things that was bubbling up in my mind about this story is remembering when it was written. I just want to read a little piece of information because I know it was published in 1922, but just because you published it doesn't mean that's when you actually wrote it. So I found out that James Joyce began writing Ulysses in 1914. Those of us who are students of history, 1914, World War I, it's breaking out. He started this shortly after he published A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So he was very deep into these characters. I think he already had a pretty clear idea of where he was taking the next segment of the story in Ulysses. He worked on it intensively for several years, and parts of this novel were serialized in the United States in a journal called The Little Review between 1918 and 1920. So some readers had already had an advance copy. He was doling these segments out. I'm really curious about how the American audience or the global audience took to that. And the full novel was finally published in Paris in 1922, which also happened to be Joyce's 40th birthday. So also an interesting mile marker in his life. From the draft of his first idea to publication, it took 8 years to complete. I think that is really quite an accomplishment. He didn't give up. He theoretically did not listen to any critics, did not say, I'm going to follow this very straightforward narrative path. He decided to break some new ground. Joey and I have in the past talked a lot about modernist writers. One of their key ideas that they were going for was to just break the mold. They were trying to maybe not necessarily be difficult, but they did not want to follow a very standard storytelling style. I think this is a great illustration of that. So if you're like, oh, this is frustrating and it doesn't make sense and I don't like it, I think that's almost the point sometimes of modernism, to push you in a direction that is uncomfortable. Any scenes in particular that jumped out to you that we haven't already discussed?
Well, I mentioned the butcher shop already. The other part was the reference to Denny's sausages. They were still a thing when I was growing up. Denny's made sausages, and there was a commercial where the little tagline was "Ding Dong Denny's." It was a little jingle. So I checked with my sister, am I just imagining this, or was that a real thing? And she said, yes, it rings a bell. So yes, I like that. And then the other thing, when he said about reading when he's in the bathroom, he takes an old copy of Tidbits magazine. And I remember that when I was a kid, that would have been lying around. It was a celebrity gossip magazine, just very superficial material, but everybody would have known it, and you could just always pick it up. It was probably in every dentist's waiting room or doctor's waiting room as well. That was nice to see that even way back then they were reading it. Didn't know that it had been around that long.
And I love that you bring that up, Ian, because it's like it's the Us Weekly of Ireland in 1922. And I think what that goes to show, and I think this is something that really resonated for me about this story, is that human nature, the need to gossip, this rich internal life, this is your public facing self and this is your private self. How do we manage the transition between the two? That is so relevant and timely. When you said Ding Dong Denny's, there was that musicality of that. One of the things that was beautiful for me as a listener and then a reader, he does a lot with calling attention to the sounds that he is experiencing. He can hear the church bells. He's like, oh, what time is it? Ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. He actually writes that out, and obviously the narrator sing-songs that, and you can hear it. Oh, that's so beautiful. But what an interesting way to ground people into the story, because as you'll recall, his wife's in bed. She calls down, scald the teapot. And it's like, okay, I'm going to do that. My wife's on my case. He's cooking this kidney and he forgets about it. He leaves it on the stove and he takes the wife her breakfast. What I really appreciated about that is that he was like, oh, she doesn't like her plate too full. So he took off a couple of things that he had put on the plate. Okay, this is a guy who's really putting his effort in. He's really trying to make this work. And then his wife wrinkles her nose. Something's burning. He's like, oh, the kidney. And he like runs down the stairs. So there's some comedic element to that as well. But also he gets distracted. He couldn't even finish his breakfast because he needed to go attend to his wife. I just thought it was very clear that Joyce really wants us to feel all the feelings around what was going on in that scene. We see it, we taste it, we smell it, we hear it. It's definitely there.
Yeah, the other part that I realized was sort of weaving through the whole chapter is the funeral. You know, it's not really prominent, but there's little references to it all the way through, from thinking he should talk to O'Rourke to say, poor old Dignam, looking at his trousers, oh, I better keep these clean for the funeral. I wonder what time the funeral's at. It's like it's on his mind the whole time, even though all these others are going on. You know, it's a special day in that sense. You know, you don't have a funeral every day. So to what extent that changed his routine, I don't know. It's breakfast in bed for his wife was just going to happen anyway, but I just thought it was interesting that was an extra element to it.
Yeah, and I appreciate that you reminded us of that because it is very subtle. Several people mention it. His wife mentions, oh, what time is the funeral? And he's like, oh, I'm not sure. I should check the paper. One of the times he's also thinking about it is going into the outhouse, right? So it's this visceral body, inescapable reality that is following him everywhere. But generally in novels, we don't talk about those things. We don't talk about that shadow of death. And I know that you are looking forward, hopefully, to reading more in Ulysses, but that theme of the funeral, what happens, who's involved, what the circumstances are, how that information is received by his community becomes a very prevalent plot line throughout the rest.
Yeah, I like that you said community, because what it's making me think of is that, I mean, Dublin's a big city and you don't know everyone who's being buried that day. There's bound to be happening all over the place. But in his community, where he walks around, presumably just in this chapter, to get from his house to the butcher and back, there's a couple of pubs that he passes. That's the community that knows Dignam, that knows that he's dead, and there's a funeral, and the church bells, presumably where the service is going to be, are pretty close by as well. It shows his little part of Dublin, even though it's a much bigger city, and presumably he gets around some more of it. I was kind of disappointed that, there's a famous place in the Bloomsday routine, which is Davy Byrne's pub. which I've been in. So I feel like, yes, I've sort of done some of this because it's in the center of Dublin and we went there as students, but it's not mentioned in this chapter.
I am fairly certain that is coming for you in the future. I highlighted a ton of references. I'm like, oh, we're going to read this sentence and this sentence. I'm like, how do you pick one rose out of a bouquet? There are so many that are so beautiful. But one of the things that he said that really made me laugh on that is there a path through Dublin that you could take that does not take you past a bar? And he was like, no. I don't see how that's going to happen, or words to that effect. I thought that was very realistic, but also a little funny. But is that true? I've never
Yep.
been.
Well, yes, there are many, many pubs in Dublin. And I strongly suspect that the night before the events in this chapter, he was in the pub because he talks about having a dry mouth a couple of times. And one of my favorite things is he uses the word druth, D-R-O-U-T-H, which is a word that we would have used on a Saturday morning ourselves, a terrible druth, because you wake up with a really dry mouth because you had several pints the night before.
That is outside of my cultural context, Ian. I am not unfamiliar with a hangover, but I am unfamiliar with that particular flavor or that particular word to describe it. And I think what has really been brought out in this conversation for me is that you are obviously not required to have a personal tie to this place or to this time frame or to these characters, but it's very easy to get swept up into it and to relate it to things in your life. I will say we're 100 years past when this was originally published, that it is still a worthwhile endeavor. Would I read this every year? No, I would not. But I think there's probably one or two more instances where I will read this over my lifetime and see how my perspective changes on what he was trying to get to us. What I thought was also interesting, his wife has a book which they drop behind the bed and he has to retrieve it. And she has a specific word that she wanted his interpretation. I don't even know what this word means. And I'm not even going to tell you the word. I'm going to let readers go find that out for themselves. But one of the ideas that came out that he was talking to her about was reincarnation. I don't know how prevalent that was as a concept at that time in Ireland, being a religious country where that may not fit into a standard religious doctrine. I don't think reincarnation is part of that story. It was really interesting that that was brought up. He's bringing us back to ancient Greece before this culture was established. He's bringing us to these ideas of going to foreign lands and reincarnation. And I thought, well, that was kind of brave because I believe that this was a primarily Catholic country at the time. He does reference Catholicism a lot in other parts. Just curious how that struck you.
Yeah, I didn't know this word, metempsychosis, to be honest. I had to look it up myself. I get the gist of it. I don't quite know how it was being used in the book that she was reading. But when he starts to think about it, he goes, yeah, it's a bit like that other thing, reincarnation, and then he's a bit more on familiar ground. Could it be that there's some influence from Ireland was British in those days. And Britain had the empire, which included India, other countries that probably had those types of traditions as part of their cultural background, and maybe that had seeped through. And there was some awareness that Bloom had of that made him realize, oh, yes, I've heard of this thing in other ways. It's a speculation.
I appreciate that. It takes me back to that scene because we have a writer, James Joyce, showing us people reading and being curious, finding words they don't understand, and asking for help. It felt like a very tender moment. The husband was like, oh, okay, that explanation didn't make sense. Let me try another. I just thought that was such a beautiful way in which communication happens for me to explain something well to another person and to try to keep turning the wheels until the understanding has actually sunk in with a reference they can latch onto is a way to show love. It is a way to show that you are really deeply interested in the other person's development. I just thought that was really sweet because I think as the story unfolds, later chapters projecting into the future, I think we're going to perhaps want to see more examples of their caretaking and love for each other. Any parting thoughts before we wrap up?
Just that I enjoyed the challenge. I did enjoy all of the little references to things that made me remember my own childhood, even though it was 50 years after this was written. I think a lot of things in my experience were echoing things that had been the way of life back then. There was another one I forgot to mention that I enjoyed, which is he talked about his tea set being Crown Derby. This was definitely something I remember in my family. Crown Derby was like the best china that you could get. If you had a Crown Derby set, you had the best. There were others that were not quite top notch, So whether we had any or not, I can't remember, but it was definitely something that we talked about. We all would have known that term. So to say that he had the sham Crown Derby, I suppose it was the best they could do. Their means, it wasn't the real thing, but it looked the same. So all those little things I thought were just very enjoyable, aside from all of the deeper things that are in the chapter. It's fun to read about things in Ireland.
Awesome. And I am so glad that you were able to share that with me and this experience. Next week, we're going to ratchet it up just one more level of difficulty in this Stream of Consciousness series. We are reading a story called The Egg and the Chicken by Clarice Lispector, who wrote in Portuguese, and it is a translation. Thank you so much, Ian, for pitch hitting for us today and sharing with us your insights and your accent for this story. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.